Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me. Tony, thank you for having me. It was about a couple of weeks ago that Tony said, can you come and do a talk? And I thought, yeah, sure, that'd be great. It's been a while since I've spoken at one of these. And then I thought, crikey, what will I talk about? And I thought, oh no, I'll talk about building and scaling DevOps and the kind of associated teams, because it's something I've done a few times before. I just hope it's relevant. And then by sheer chance this morning, what ends up in my inbox, but browsing through Reddit, it is the Perfect State of DevOps report. And this comes out with a couple of nuggets. The first one is, at scale, DevOps is rarely still being done well. And I thought, good, well, maybe some of the stuff I'll talk about will still be relevant and useful. And it talks about only about a shift from about 10 to 18% of organizations are what it would class as highly proficient or highly good at doing this DevOps thing. That's over about the last 4 years. So that led me to think, good, there's still work to do here. All of you listening to this either are doing it well or have a keen interest. And hopefully I can depart a little bit from my rambling through some stories, some history, and some philosophy on DevOps and how I see it to help you all. So let's begin. Here's what we're going to talk about. I'm going to give you just my little take, my journey on DevOps and why I'm here. I'm going to talk about what's in it for you, putting DevOps or similar structures into your organization. How do you structure it? What kind of objectives do you give those teams? Some practical tips on how you scale those and scale the business around it. And importantly, how can you tell it's working? What kind of KPIs do you look at? And then I'll leave a screen at the end that you can have a quick snapshot of, or I'm sure the slides will be distributed afterwards, with a few key resources that I've really enjoyed over the last few years to help me. A little bit about me before we begin. I'm Richard Haigh. I'm getting on a bit now. I'm about 23 years in tech. I'm currently the CTO at HealthHero, and I've had quite a lot of experience building large, scalable systems, quite often with my DevOps hat on, for several organizations like Betfair, like Just Eat. So my main interest is around those scalable systems. And I'm easily bored, so I do a whole load of other things. So if you ever bump into me awkwardly in a lift, I can pretty much talk to you about anything, I hope. A little bit about HealthHero. A lot of you won't have heard of us. HealthHero is the largest telemedicine organization in Europe at the moment. And we are on an absolute mission to simplify healthcare and improve lives. We look after about 23 million lives at the moment. We deal with over 1,000 businesses. We have a CQC Excellence Award 2 in a row. It's very unusual. That's a sign of our clinical expertise, and an NPS of around 72. And we are, no surprise, hiring. We're scaling up fast at the moment across Europe and hiring in London, Bristol, Paris, Rennes and Berlin for pretty much all roles going. So if you fancy getting into telehealth, it is the right time to do it. Please give me a shout up after this. So let me tell you about DevOps and my story. How did it all start and how did I get to where I am now? There's a few faces here I'll talk you through that helped me along my journey. So when I'm talking about DevOps throughout this presentation, I'm talking about the WinOps, the TestOps, the SRE, the every various version of ops that you can think about that this has spawned from the original. They're all doing vaguely the same sorts of things. But here's what I learned as I went along. So I think it's arguable that about 2009 was the first time that DevOps really came to light. There's a guy called Patrick Dubois, he's second down on the right here, who's kind of fondly called the grandfather of DevOps. And he coined this phase, put it together, and started a very successful conference that goes on to this day around it. Now, at that time, I didn't really know about DevOps, and nor did the person who hired me into my first role in 2011. It's a guy called Pete Craggle at the top there. Now, Pete wanted someone to come in to his development team and help because they were struggling to release software with the right kind of cadence. They were struggling to test it. They were interrupting the business every time they deployed. And he needed someone who had a bit of an understanding of operations and technology to come in and help put it together. And unbeknownst to me, this was my first DevOps role, starting to put in place systems, starting to put in place teams that combined automation, testing, development, all into a systematic way of doing things that allowed us to then turn up the frequency of release. What I really learned from this is no one really knew what they were doing back then. There were very few tools. They were quite immature. Trying to patch it together was difficult. And there was a real battle between, hang on, I'm a developer, I don't want to get involved in operations. Or hang on, I'm a tester, I take this thing, I reset it up and tune it myself, and then I test it and then tell the devs what's wrong with it. And around we're going. So it was a real kind of lesson of learning and trying to pick what worked and put it back into that business. Luckily, a couple of years later, I went to my first proper DevOps conference. This is where I met Patrick and Gene below him, who, if you haven't read it, wrote a book called The Phoenix Project, which is a good bedtime read, and will give you a few tips and tricks to in putting stuff like this into businesses. But that conference was really good because what I learned from this is that DevOps was taking off. The philosophy behind it of being able to automate to get you a speed of release and also a quality control was really starting to take root. And large organizations were starting to produce not only tooling and processes you could use, but also professional services to help you get on board. And this was a real kind of start of, okay, this is starting to industrialize, it's starting to get really useful. And fast forward a few years, I undertook what I call my first serious DevOps focused project. And this is where, along with a guy called Stephen Armstrong, who's bottom right there, we put together what scaled up to be something like 100,000 core open source cloud environment. I was working for a gaming company at the moment, so we couldn't use public cloud, but we put this together, and we put it together in a way that allowed the developers to basically, through code, write their own consumption, not only of their storage and their compute, but also right down to their networking. And this was a real eye-opener to me that actually you could start to use this stuff as an actual strategic advantage for the businesses. I've included a couple of links throughout the presentation, but the first one, there's a white paper that we wrote at the time that details how much of an enabler that was to the business. And then since then onwards, really for me, it's just been about DevOps isn't a thing, it's a culture, it's the way of doing it. I've always worried a bit about people with a DevOps job or a DevOps. I know that they're doing the role and they're following that philosophy. But for me, everyone in engineering should be interested in DevOps and should understand this philosophy and try and live with it. You should really own what you produce and own it right the way through to when it's no longer being used. So over the years, what have I really learned? What does DevOps boil down to? Well, no surprise, it kind of boils down to the dev part and the ops part. And often I get asked as a CTO, what is my actual job? What do I really do? And I tend to reply that I do two main things for the business. The first one is I allow the creation of new revenue. And for an engineer, for a developer, that is getting new features, new code, new systems out to production as quickly as possible. The faster that cadence, the faster we can generate new revenue out of those products. And the second thing I do is I protect current revenue. So we look after customers currently using our systems and services. We make sure that our systems are well behaved. And really that's reliability, availability of those systems and sites. And ultimately that create new revenue, protect new revenue is DevOps in a nutshell to me. So let's step a little bit into what's in it for you. How can it help you? So I'm going to make an assumption that you would be listening to this because you're looking to scale your business up, scale your engineering department up. And this is where DevOps really helps as a philosophy, because scale requires a couple of things. Once you start to get to the size where the network effect of your organization means that you don't know everyone, you can't get everyone into a room to discuss how you're going to do something, groupthink becomes too big to control, you need something that will give you elements of control centrally, but also elements of autonomy and agility as you go out towards the outskirts. Now, if any of you like reading business reviews, there's a Harvard business review called Managing the Right Tension, and this specifically talks about how do you manage centralized decision-making versus distributed autonomy and decision-making at the edge. And they introduce a concept called diagonal assets. And these are assets that cross through that horizontal, that vertical, that central, and that distributed. And to me, DevOps is a prime example of one of these one of these assets. So it gives you several things. It does give you control at the center. DevOps delivers embedded process, a way of doing things. This helps because it avoids duplication of effort. So it gives you an efficiency. You set up a system and a service and you give it to all of the teams to use, and you just have to maintain and run that once. It helps you learn because mistakes that are made tend to be incorporated back into those processes, and therefore everyone benefits from them. And it also gives you an advantage in inertia. If you have those systems and those processes and they work, when you scale up and land another team and maybe another team in a different country even, you can get that team spun up quickly because you've got those processes in place. So that inertia is low. Classical diagonal asset, it's an enabler. And I think Andy and James have both talked about enabling earlier on. But that centralized tooling enables teams, whether it's something simple like logging and monitoring that allows teams to very quickly understand the interactions of their systems versus others, or first some top line information that they're getting. It gives them that enabler to self-serve to try and ask what's wrong, what could we be doing better? And it allows extensibility. So through automation, security, the various hooks we put into that, you allow the teams to take those and enable them to construct various systems or various processes in their own way, with some, following that centralized control where needed, but in a way that suits them. And of course, DevOps promotes autonomy to deliver that agility. So whether that's trying to have a very transparent way of working, that kind of internal open source approach where everyone can see, check out, and then replay with code that's there and push it back into the original teams, whether it's freedom to deviate from those processes, So quite often, even though the processes are there, you kind of allow people to play along within those a little bit. And by doing that, you can actually get this kind of survival of this fittest approach, where you pull wisdom from the whole engineering organization. The stuff that really works tends to stick and then tends to go pervasively around the rest of the teams. What about structuring teams? So I thought a little bit about advice I would give to how would you set up and structure these engineering teams that you might call platform or infrastructure or your DevOps area, or whatever you might call it. And there's a few things here. For me, the biggest one I've seen over the years is try not to put a DevOps in a team. For a team to have a DevOps, try and form these central teams. And I think both Andy and James spoke about this, these enablement teams. The central team means that you focus that team on providing enablers for the development teams, but importantly, the development teams self-serve wherever they can for the software development lifecycle. And what does that mean? Well, where I've seen teams without DevOps, it's all fine until our DevOps goes on holiday and then the team doesn't release or doesn't know how to recover when something's gone wrong or doesn't know that they've got some security issue. So by centralizing this and teaching the development teams, you end up with a much more scalable organization in itself. Now, if I look into those central teams, I kind of recognized 5 different areas that I've tended over the years to build those teams into. In no real particular order, but service operations to me is bossing the first 10 minutes of any incident. These are the guys that are maybe looking at high-level monitoring statistics. They are armed with run books. Hopefully they are well-equipped engineers in their own right. And when things start to look a bit gnarly, these guys are quite often the first on point to try and diagnose and triage what's wrong and who to call out to help it. And if you get it really right, they quite often, as part of that triage, can fix and correct something that's going wrong in the first place. They're also a central point for anyone who thinks they've seen something fishy to pick up the phone or get on Slack or whatever and go and report it to. Some of those teams I've always had somewhere around the hosting environment, those cloud operations. And although pretty much all of us now consume public cloud, there's still an art to understanding how to structure that, how to set up its tenancy. James talked us through in GCP how we put some of that together. But I still think there's room there for a team who understands that well. And when we're setting up some of those big tenancies and when we're doing some large migrations or upgrades, can act as a point of enablement for the dev teams there. Delivery automation is really around that CI/CD, those automated tool chains and everything that hooks into those, whether it's testing, security, et cetera, et cetera. But again, having strong skills in a central team that is able to design these, because they tend to be central and rolled out to everyone, and then maintain them and teach people how to use them, I think is quite important. Observability or telemetry, if you don't like the term, but again, as you scale teams out, you tend to find that your time series monitoring, your event monitoring, those systems get very large, very difficult to run. Bare metal elk stacks, I think Andy, you talked about it, I recognize that. But trying to put together and run these systems centrally is a job within itself. So you need someone specialized, you need a team that's expert in doing that to maintain those. And in fact, quite often these systems get classed to me as like tier 0. Without them, you can't see what's going on. Therefore, it's potentially worse than a P1 with your site down. And last but not least by any means is some element of service management. And this is really joining up the engineering teams to the commercial teams. There's a little bit of BizOps in there somewhere. But this is basically when things start going a bit wrong or we're starting to look at why things are behaving in a way, it's a small number of people that can package that information in a language that the business understands and take some of the pressure off your engineering teams by holding those communications and keeping that going. So what about principles, how to run these teams? Well, there's 3 I thought of. The first one is that I really like that internal consulting style. I like these teams to be available to help and to teach, not necessarily to be there and do. Now, certainly while you're creating something from new and you're putting a new system or tool in place, for sure there might be a bit more of a push on helping teams out directly. But what I really try and get to is where these central teams are almost like an internal roaming consultancy. Maybe they're proactively looking for issues and then looking to teach teams how to avoid them, or maybe they're retrospectively helping teams bulk out with specialist knowledge to understand root cause before we can figure out what's going on. I've also found more seniority in these central teams pays off. If you're going to put your seniority anywhere as a force multiplier, these teams really can have that impact. So having people that really understand your tooling, your hosting, etc., that have been around the block a few times, really helps avoid mistakes, which would then cascade out to all of the other teams. And last but not least, approaching these DevOps, these infrastructure teams and product engineering teams the same, both first-class citizens. And by that, I mean, when you come around to doing your monthly or your quarterly product planning, your infrastructure, your central teams, they should be part of that as well. They should be following exactly the same routines. when you're talking about how do I know my customer, how do I know what to build, these teams should have a product manager that should help and understand how to be that interface to the customer. And when you're looking at, hang on a minute, how do we maintain, how do we do root cause when things have gone wrong, how do we incident manage when things happen in these infrastructure teams, it should be no different than any other product you're running. It should look and feel exactly the same in terms of that process and setup. And to help me do some of that, there's a few ceremonies that I've tended to run around these teams, some daily, some weekly, etc. So depending on your scale, but when you get big enough, production meetings I think are really useful. I've done them daily when we've been big teams, weekly when we're in smaller teams. But this is a chance for everyone to look at the incidents that have occurred since the last production meeting, as well as maybe anything big that's still overhanging. And this allows your development teams, your infrastructure teams, your leadership to get together in that certain period and look at these issues and try and understand the risk that they're carrying. And importantly, the people in those meetings should be the people that can have the authority to go and change what a development team is doing today. Because if something is drastically wrong and carrying a massive amount of risk, you want to be able to steer that team into fixing that immediately. Tend to run a weekly risk meeting, or in smaller teams, maybe a monthly risk meeting. And this is when you're looking at the aggregate, the overview of how much risk are we carrying? Are we carrying any specifically large risks that we're still keeping? And I tend to have a smaller group of people in that. But again, you're looking at, are we doing enough this week to keep on top of this? Do we need to put a bit more effort in? Maybe do we need to spike the teams on paying back some tech debt for a sprint in order to calm some of this down? Now, going wider into the general population and bringing this kind of operational excellence out, tend to run a monthly all hands. And there I really like looking at some of the key KPIs that we're managing the teams by, so people know how we're doing, but also then looking at any lessons we've learned since the last all hands. And one of the things I really enjoyed was every time we've got a big system outage or a big product outage and we understand and we've learned from it in a way that is very supportive, I really like that team to come to these monthly all hands and discuss with the whole entire engineering and product organization what went wrong, how they found it, how they fixed it, and what they've learned from it. This is really key because it just helps that learning across these wider teams, especially as you start scaling multinationally. This becomes really important. And last in this list is well-structured incident management. So don't wait for it to go wrong to think it through. It's really worth putting in place some well-thought-out structure to what happens when it goes bang. Who do you need to call? How do you get it fixed? What roles do people have during this? How do you communicate to your customers, to your internal stakeholders, to your exec? And when it's all over, how do you make sure that you systematically capture the learnings and go forward with it, rather than, take your foot off the gas because the pressure's gone and forget about it and get busy back to normal work? So the purpose of DevOps, the associated teams, is scale. The goals are really around enabling. What objectives do I set these teams? How do I motivate these teams to do well? And over the years, I've come up with this list of 5 that I quite like. The first 2 maybe are primary objectives. The last 3 may be secondary, but I think they're all important in their own right. So no surprise, but the first one, relentlessly protect site availability. This is clearly about that protecting existing revenue and looking after our existing customers. And this goes hand in hand in the world of DevOps with enabling change to be delivered fast, but with quality. This is the entire birth of DevOps, was providing these 2. The third one's an efficiency thing. So, we should be intelligent, we should be efficient in using our infrastructure and its resources. That doesn't necessarily just mean save the money or get it for the least value. It could be using it in a way that gives us the fastest time to market or the easiest way to integrate other systems. But you really want to motivate your teams to understand the infrastructure that they're consuming and do so in an intelligent way. Innovating to stay ahead's an interesting one. The world of tech moves fast. The world of DevOps-associated tooling has gone through a period of certainly moving even faster. But I think you need to carve out or give your team some license to spend some time understanding how it's evolving, what's coming up and what's new. Now, it's not a reason to go and change your entire CI build every 3 months, but certainly once in a while you want to look at why we're still using this. Is it still the most sensible thing to do? Should we be doing something else? And as some of the cloud providers are catching up and providing their own CI/CD, I can start to see that there's a way that sometimes you stop stringing together open source stuff yourself and you start to consume from some of those providers. I'm sure that shift will continue to wax and wane as we go ahead. And then lastly, a really important one for me is these teams have got to help you foster the right culture. And I'll talk a bit about some of that later. But these guys are at the heart of engineering. They set the agenda for a lot of how the development teams work and how they get on. I think it's really important that you motivate these teams to help foster that right culture for engineering across the whole. So I thought about some practical tips I could give you that I've learned as I've gone and scaled these organizations up. And in my career, I think I've gone from engineering teams of 20 to engineering teams of 2,000 and many times in between. The first one for me is a really important one. It's about trust. So I've worked in regulated backgrounds. I'm currently in one. I've worked in unregulated backgrounds. But regardless, I really like the idea of having high trust in your engineering teams. So I trust developers to have access to production, but there's always a but under certain circumstances and certain control. And that absolute accountability for me comes hand in hand with the trust. So anyone can do just about anything, but I have absolute control over seeing who's done what when. So we can always look at who did what, why did they do it? And for things like emergency access to production, anyone should be able to do it, but probably through a break class process. So you can control it and you can report on it. And if you get this right, you allow people to do what they need to do in the moment, but you do so in a way that is sensible to do, that is answering to governance, and can scale with you without having lots of boundaries of authority needing to be taken before someone can deploy a fix, for example. I like to encourage people to focus on the outcomes of processes, not the mechanics of it. So you'll hear teams talking about, hey, we're going to run Scrum, we're going to run Kanban, we're going to do this newfound thing. And I often think, you know what, I think you should be free to experiment and you should be free to run your team as a tech lead the way you want to. What I care about is some of the outcomes of that process. And as long as you can give me those outcomes, I care less about what you put in place to do that. And those outcomes might be a way to report on X, Y, Z, or a way to make sure that you're documenting here, or a way to make sure that you are using a certain couple of tools. But outside of that, I'm very happy to let teams experiment. This goes back to that survival of the fittest. Encourage intelligent people to try things. They'll come up with a way of doing it better than you, and then hopefully that spreads to others. Transparent systems is also important. I've never been a fan of people hiding source code, hiding projects, hiding what's been shipped to production when. I really like these things being open. Admittedly, a lot of it would be open read-only for the majority of the population, but I like the idea that anyone should be able to self-serve or see what other teams are doing if it helps them. Probably the biggest on this list, although it's halfway down, is psychological safety. And if you've been reading at all around burnout over the last few years, reading at all about what motivates teams, this one is, and I honestly believe will continue to be for the time future, be a really important one. So you want your teams to come to work and do a good job and not be afraid of the consequences. People will make mistakes and you have to accept that. And really, I think you show yourself for how you deal when you've made a mistake and how you help people recover from that and how you take learnings from it. So one of the biggest important things for me is that element of psychological safety, that no fear at work for people. I think that's the only way you get the best out of people. Rotating engineers is an easy one. Try not to leave people where they are for 2 years in a row. They get a little bit bored and a little bit antsy. So if you can find a reason after a year or 18 months to shuffle it up a bit, it always tends to go down well. You also end up taking experience from one team to another team, and that cross-seeding always works out very well. The internal consulting approach I've talked about, that's really setting up these central teams in a way that they go and enable and help others rather than totally controlling a piece of infrastructure or a piece of tooling for themselves. And gamification is a really interesting one and sometimes overused, but I've found time and time again that by putting some kind of scorecard, some kind of sheet up to show engineers or show a team how they're doing, maybe that's how they're doing on some of the KPIs, maybe that's some softer things, and allowing them to compare themselves to their own selves in a previous instance of some of their teams. It's always amazing to see how the friendly rivalry sparks up and teams try and self-improve and accelerates that organizational learning. And then lastly, especially if you're a manager, it's choose the KPIs. Choose very carefully how you're going to manage your teams. And I'll talk a bit about that now. So how do you know it's working? How do you know this whole DevOps thing is actually delivering anything? I've spent too many hours anguishing over various KPIs that I've looked at, arguing why velocity is not a good way to track a team's progress. Trying to work out, how do we match this agile product approach to this waterfall roadmap request from senior management? How do we put it together? And I've ended up running these 5 KPIs across almost all of my engineering teams in one guise or another. So let me talk to you about them quickly. So the first one, probably for me the most important, it's around predictability. If you're an engineering team and you estimate something's going to take 10 points, 5 days, 2 sprints, whatever, how predictable is that? How reliable is that? And one of the things I've come to look at is, if you look at over time, that estimation versus what was actually delivered and you track it, you can tell a lot of interesting things about those teams. You can see whether a team is maturing and gelling, whether they're getting on. You can see whether their work is being interrupted with random, strange, sideways work coming in, because all of it gets shown in how predictable that team is in its delivery. A really good, really mature team actually has quite a narrow variance. And if you're in Jira or something, you can plot all this automatically off the various user stories going through. A new team takes a while to settle down, in my experience, about 6 weeks. A team that's had a shock will bumble around for a bit and then settle down again after about 6 weeks. Maybe that shock is that they've been split into two because the team's got so large it actually hired a second team, or maybe it's they've been steered to a different product because we pivoted and one product hasn't worked. Release frequency is an easy one, and this isn't about me trying to get more out of a team. This for me is an indication of, again, how well that team is breaking down work. Good teams supported by good DevOps philosophy and good systems below them produce rapid, small amounts of change. And always, 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 that has been a better process in terms of then operationally managing and looking after these high-scale systems. So I tend to look at that pace of change to try and give me a view of whether those teams are heading in the right direction. There's clearly something around quality, and for me, that's the number of errors released to production, usually as a percentage of the total errors. And in fact, I read in the State of DevOps that under 5% is considered a high-performing organization. And in my experience, that's entirely true. And in fact, I think when you go at scale, I think you can get an order of magnitude less than that with some effort. The next one is around the amount of risk that your organization is carrying. I really like to look at open incidents, where an incident is something unexpected that's happened in production. P1 through P5, whatever it's going to be, there's a number that is open. And those incidents sit in teams' backlogs until they're resolved. So what I like to look at is how many do we have open per team, per department, per area, or for the entire organization, week on week. And that allows me to get a feel for, over time, over maybe a month, 6 weeks, about whether we are taking on too much tech debt or reacting to it, whether we're going too fast, or perversely, the other side, whether actually we're being too careful and we could release the brakes a little bit and go faster and make a few more mistakes and get the advantage of pushing product slightly faster out the door. And then more of a soft side, but just as important, is some way of managing motivation and enthusiasm within your teams. And the one I love and keep coming back to is the squad health check model that Spotify put out, which has a series of qualitative questions that you can ask your development teams to see how they're feeling. So these 5 tend to be the KPIs that I tend to look at my organization, the lens I look at it through. And whether it's quarterly updates from the tech teams, and we'll walk through these, we try to ask ourselves, what's this data showing us? What are the secondary and tertiary things that are giving us these indicators? Some of them are leading, some are lagging, but you need to work that out. But this is a good starter for 10 if you want to try it. So that's it for my chat. I've listed a few resources. There's a few books that I really like. Accelerate, for me, really opened my eyes to how to manage KPIs and how to work out whether teams are working or not. The Google SRE book was full of a load of good stories, some of them way too scaled for me to use. Some of them didn't quite make sense, but a lot of them were great stories of how to do things slightly differently. DevOps for Networking came out to the back of a guy called Steve Armstrong off that project that I did in 2016. And it was a technical book on how to take this DevOps approach into software-defined networking as well. I worked with a guy called Grant Smith who wrote Next Gen DevOps, which is a really good introduction to organizationally where DevOps fits and how it's grown into place. There's that Harvard Business Review that I spoke to earlier, which have a read if you're interested in how you can set up and run business units or organizations within your business that may naturally be in tension with each other. That Spotify health check we've just talked about. The conference DevOps Days, it's still going. It's amazing. I haven't been to one for a while, but I really am looking forward to post-COVID doing so. And then lastly, but not least, of course, our careers page at HealthHero, where we're hiring all sorts of engineers. Thank you very much indeed.